Hi there, folks. This is Jason Montague, and for Neal Sample, welcome to Real Technical Midwest.
So I think the thing that is important to get to today is to start talking about hopefully a new show we can launch here.
Yeah.
And the primary focus, but we could debate this, is technology, sort of a tech-forward conversation, I think, trying to talk to executives or influence, people of influence in business, in the tech space, but also having some deep technical conversations, because I know you and I both appreciate that and kind of want to talk about that. And I think it's important to do that. But what's your thought? I mean, how do you think, where do you think, I don't want to be the yet another tech executive podcast kind of thing. However, what are your thoughts about where we should have conversations? What do you think needs to be discussed?
I think, you're right about probably don't need to be, yet another tech podcast, because there are plenty. So I think focusing a little bit on the difference would be useful, right? Which is why the idea of hashtag Midwest was attractive, because there's not a lot with that focus. You usually get like a subject matter focus, like you've got somebody who's super excited about Bitcoin or blockchain more generally as a tech function, or maybe it's leadership, and it's somebody off on their own, or something like the HBR. So I think something with a focus is good. But I also think covering a lot of ground would be nice. One of my favorite shows when I used to listen to the radio, sort of in the pre-podcast era, was Car Talk, right? It was Click and Clack. yeah. Like those guys. Yeah. And they were super knowledgeable about whatever, right? Like my 76 Buick has a rattle at 54 miles an hour. And they're like, yeah, it's going to be a passenger side rock arm there. What do you think of Chowder? And they would go off on, some topic that's maybe political or social, something that's relevant. So I kind of like that format where they generally have a steel thread. Like they're there, it's Car Talk. You're not there for recipes and advice on planting crops or whatever. But at the same time, it's kind of amusing. They are fine to get off topic and spend some time on different topics or whatever. So, yeah.
I think that's good. I agree. And I think this conversational thing is important. I think dialing in, it's funny because the immediate advice all the time is hyper focus. That will actually help, because you can be a real owner almost of a particular small thing, and then it'll just grow and grow and grow. I don't necessarily feel like that's what you and I are trying to do here per se. I do think this is as much about what I am interested in doing, and hopefully what you are, and what we like to talk about, and that actually becomes engaging in and of itself. But I think that the business landscape and how technology fits in, how people talk about it, I think there's so many little, avenues and nooks and crannies we could talk about that are awesome or scary or whatever. And I just don't think that people play the field like that too much, and that's actually what I talk about in my normal day-to-day. So feels like this could be a nice opportunity. I also think someone, and I said this before, you have a perspective that a lot of people in the Midwest don't have, which is maybe some do, but you grew up on one of the coasts in the biggest, most prolific technology hub ever produced. And one of the things I hear so often is, how can we become the Silicon Valley of whatever, southeastern Illinois? Why would you want to do that, for one? But two, how are you what specifically are you trying to emulate? What are those things? I think you have this perspective, which is like, look, I've seen all these things. I've worked in all these domains, and it would be just nice to hear a perspective that sort of has been in all these things, the value of it, and the things that are like, that's not a thing we should be trying to do. What do you think about that? I mean, do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I think it is interesting. So I've been kind of across the spectrum, right? So if you draw kind of the geography of the U.S. as sort of east to west, have covered, kind of the whole thing. If you draw on the y-axis, kind of small company to large company, new company to old company, established, et cetera, I've kind of done that whole thing, and done some permutations. And, it was really interesting when I was first starting out, actually in the early 2000s, so a little bit later, but was at Yahoo. And we had this influx of students from Washington University. And they had this email address, Wustl, WUSTL.edu. And I had no idea what that meant, and I couldn't figure it out because I thought, WashU must be in like Virginia or Maryland or DC or something. Right. And I'll be honest, didn't even know that it was a great school, much less in St. Louis, in Missouri. And they were producing all these engineering grads, and we'd hired a couple of them, and it became like this pipeline. And they had a belief, an abiding conviction that in order to use their degree and to make something of it and to get ahead, they would need to go where the action was. And it was definitely somewhere other than St. Louis, right, in that particular instance.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is a lot of those folks that I know today, now that they're a little older, a little more mature, a lot of them have sort of come home. Like you see people coming home to Wisconsin, coming home to St. Louis in that particular instance. And one of the things is that I think they kind of figure it out after they get older, that there's a quality of life that they can have and still do what they want to do. I also think that there are some real changes. It's different than it was 20 plus years ago. That 20-ish years ago, you kind of did have to leave, right? We didn't have the remote collaboration technologies. We didn't have, everybody wasn't on Zoom and Skype and whatever. It would have been Skype, then Zoom, and this was before any of those things. This was before even WhatsApp. And so you did move, you did pick up, you did relocate. So I think there's something really powerful there. It is also not universally accepted. There are a lot of companies that are still struggling with the idea of remote workforce and what that does to the corporate culture, to the office culture, et cetera. And there are companies here that are struggling with that. And, that is definitely something to talk about. I think more broadly, you would think all companies had transitioned already. You would think they would all know that at some point, or at some level rather, they are technology companies. Whether they need a mobile app to interface with their customers, whether it's always on service, access to data-driven decision making, artificial intelligence, etc. It seems obvious to somebody who does this for a living. There are an amazing number of companies that are still not there. That are
and they actively resist. I think they hear the phrase that you just mentioned. Everyone's a data company or a technology company, and they really make it their business to say we are not that. We are right. We sell cars or whatever they're going to say.
Yeah,
and I will say that constrains their the opportunities that are available to them, because I think they just kind of plug away.
Yeah,
doing the things they've always done. But do you see that in small companies and big ones, or is it really predominantly these larger dyed-in-the-wool type institutions?
So I think it's more the big ones and the really small ones. And what I mean by that, it's the endpoints. It's the mom and pop shops that they're not big enough. They maybe run an auto detailing place, and they're not big enough to have an IT department. And finances are maybe done in Quicken, right? Like there isn't a CFO. These are like little tiny, whether it's retail or service industry type jobs. I think for them, not there, right? Because it's just difficult and hard. But I think for a lot of the bigger successful companies, it's a struggle for them more around inertia. Just they've been around for so long. They've been working for so long. There is something to be said for, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that success is its own reward. But you also get people who really struggle with the idea that they're doing something wrong because they're financially successful. They've been around for a long time. They have a strong brand. There's a lot of maybe don't rock the boat. Like there are lots of reasons that go into it, but a lot of the larger legacy companies have a very difficult time transitioning en masse. You'll get pockets.
Yep.
You'll get initiatives. You'll get, transition to new ERP system.
Yeah.
And,
often tied to an individual, like someone that comes in and really is energetic and can do it.
Right.
When they leave, it almost always stops immediately.
Right.
And,
it's kind of going against the grain.
Yeah.
But even in those situations, eventually everybody will get there.
Yeah.
If you show up and you're a big company and whatever it is you do, whether it's financial services or healthcare or whatever, if you don't have an app and your customers can't effectively contact you or see their own data or self-serve or whatever, eventually the market will make you go away.
You're right. Exactly.
But there's a lot of gray area right now. We're in a really interesting state where 20 years ago, many of these companies weren't talking about digital transformation. And some of them are just talking about it now and not really far down the road.
You know what's interesting? I feel like there was an article I was reading, or maybe it was a meme even. I don't know what it was, but there was this idea long ago, and it was exacerbated by just complete lack of awareness at a business leader level, how much effort it would take to do certain things. So, let's take the entire workforce and move them home tomorrow. Can we do that?
Yeah.
And the perception was 700 days. I mean, it was a literal survey. And it was like the average executive thought that would take 700 days. Actual time 14 days. And it was like one thing after the next.
Yeah.
600 days, 8 days. Can we safely move our data into a cloud ecosystem? That we thought 3 years, and it took 4 days. It was that stark. So I think those not maybe mental or belief barriers are eroded pretty quick in the early days of this pandemic, and I think that would be an interesting thing to talk about. On the flip side, though, maybe it would be interesting, and I would say it's analogous to going to get a graduate degree. So if you are really an energetic entrepreneur, there will be people that would say, why would you ever go to school? You can learn everything you need to know. Just try stuff.
Yeah.
Comb the YouTube archives, and you don't need to be there. And your kids don't need to be there. They can learn whatever they need to learn, in other ways. But the real people interaction and what you're learning about when you're doing these things is a real thing. It's an important relational thing. And I just wonder, like, for businesses, I think now that we're a few years into this, some people thought they were like ready to just like, hey, we're just going to be remote. And now they're looking at it and saying, Jesus, like, what is going on? Like, we can't build a culture. We can't do any of these things. There's not a lot of loyalty with the new people because they don't know anybody.
Right.
I forget, Elon Musk just had a leaked email. A
couple of them. I read them, yeah.
Which are hysterical, but it was like, if you want to pretend to work somewhere else, you can do that there. Otherwise, you got to be in the facility. Well, I think that would be fun to talk about, but there's a lot of sides to that. It's not
I
simple.
think so too. I think that's one that's got a lot of opportunity, a lot of ground. I think one of the things that was there, I actually think we had an overconfidence in our ability to manage folks remotely, that we didn't think it was that hard. And to an extent, if you have a long tenured, well-established team and you tell them to go home and work remotely and collaborate over Zoom, you're not going to see a lot of productivity hit. You might even see an immediate kind of uptick if you are cashing in on the commute time and that sort of thing. Getting more quiet time, getting more thought time sort of thing. On the other hand, though, integrating new employees who don't understand the corporate culture, don't understand the team rhythms, these things are hard, and they're a skill set that we haven't been taught. It actually is a different skill set, in my opinion, that the need to train people, for example, on how to spin up and manage a remote team, I don't even think we fully realized it, because we believe we're good managers. we believe we know what we're doing. And in a lot of cases, the pandemic showed, at least early on, kind of an uptick in productivity and an uptick in output. So, gosh, we must definitely be doing it right. I'm not convinced. I actually think that and we're starting to see it now in the Great Resignation, and you could blame it on economic factors. You could also blame it, though, on people, sort of being fed up with what they have their eyes open to now, and their eyes open to the possibilities on the outside and what other people could offer them and so on. And part of that is, well, if you want to keep your employees engaged and you want your health metrics high, then you've got to manage them and engage them better, right?
I do think one of the things that I've learned, and we can dig into this in a subsequent conversation, but it's nice to touch on a few of these big ones. It's interesting. I love the phrase, the worst of both worlds. I drive to the office to get on a Zoom meeting, which is exactly what most of us do. We drive in and nobody's sitting next to you anyway, right? You're just on a Zoom call. But the idea that it has to be the way it used to be, or it's got to be like everyone's 100% remote, I think both are equally wrong for the similar reason. And I think it's nice that now people are seeing that, hey, there's options. What's the best way for us to onboard, engage a team, work day to day? Do we always have to be in front of each other? Maybe not. So there's something in between, or something waiting there for some people to really help discover and develop and to teach a lot of the folks that don't know how to do it. But so.
I do. I will say there is one thing that'll probably come out of it that'll be pretty good, is that we'll have to be thoughtful and intentional about the time that we spend together, because it becomes a little more precious when people have expectations to be on the outside. And I don't know what it's been like for you in sort of bigger corporate cultures, but I've heard places that I've been working at before described as we have a meeting culture. That you have a meeting for everything all day long. You're in meetings. It's status meetings. It's development meetings. It's kickoff meetings, etc. And the discipline that's come around because you're not in place, and people's tolerance for that has kind of gone down, I actually think that'll be really powerful. So as long as you're thoughtful about it now, we probably end up in a better place kind of post-pandemic.
Did you experience that? So we've kind of gone through that, and a lot of my network, I think, has appreciated the change. One of the things that has happened over time is it's almost a FOMO thing, right? One, like, there's no more serendipitous, I bumped into you at the, somewhere.
I miss that, I will say.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a lot of work happens there. It's an interest, a lot of value is added.
Culture building.
All of it, but I would, even execution happens in these weird little moments, but we have now, people, if there is a meeting, people are like, I have to have my face there. My face has to show up. I kind of want to say, just record yourself and just send that to us. Like, if you really don't have anything to add, I promise you're not missing anything.
Right.
But it's tough to promise when I'm not sure what they're fearful of. Right.
Right.
So we've tipped a little that way. And so, yes, I think there's been some improvements. There's been some strange behavior that is new because no one had to do this before. But yeah, lots to talk about. I would say, so I would say to sort of wrap that up, I think the pandemic, the new way of we work as a society, what is the Midwest as a destination for, strong either entrepreneurs or executives or software developers or data developers. It feels like that's opened up quite a lot as well, because now there's no borders necessarily for some of these companies. Do you think that would be a good thing for us to kind of dig into?
I think so. And that's where I look at one of those intrinsic advantages of the Midwest, that I do think that a lot of times, whether it was quality of life, cost of living, right, places like this that have an advantage didn't have the advantage in the workplace, in the being on site at Apple, in Cupertino or whatever, that those competitive elements that make this place great were sort of lost in the shuffle. But it's like, fine, great, I can move back home when I retire or after I make my money, but I can't afford to be in the workplace right now and raise my kids in a community that I want to, because I'm making this trade-off. And that's the thing that I think is different, is that trade-off is no longer, and again, it's not black and white, but the scales have tipped. The ability to work remotely is tipped, et cetera. And now the advantages of cost of living and quality of life are really going to start to shine through. Before they were kind of occluded by fixed geography, inability to travel, need to be on site. Like Elon's note said, at least 40 hours a week. I don't know if you read that.
I did read that. Yep.
A minimum of 40 hours a week on site. Doesn't care, where you're getting your job done, but I don't know, maybe they're even on time cards.
Well, who knows? But he one of the points I know he made was, look, if you're leading an organization that's manufacturing a physical thing and you're a state away, pretending to manage them, like, does that really work? I mean, look, I'm not going to venture a guess. I have a belief that would be tough. And yeah, you probably should be you should probably shoulder up and be there, because everyone you lead's there. I would say, it's a gray area when we talk about knowledge work and all these other things, and the people have to be there to write software. That's not a physical good. But yeah, there's so lots to talk about, I think, there, and how the Midwest kind of plays into the New World Order, so to speak. You did say something interesting. 20 years ago, a lot of this wasn't really available to us. 100% agree with that. So things are changing so rapidly that I think there's a likely a tail on a lot of these ideas. And so I think we haven't really seen any huge movement. I think, I'm trying to draw a comparison to like Nashville, which is getting blown up right now by kind of LA people. They're all moving there in mass. And
weather's great, housing's cheap, barbecue's amazing.
The climate's nice, the whole thing, right? It's a cool little city that's becoming a cool huge city with all, they're sort of replicating a lot of the problems of I shouldn't say that. They're not replicating the LA problem, but they're creating some further issues for local people that now are being priced out of their own neighborhoods and things. And you kind of wonder, is the Midwest sort of due for that? Are there locales inside of the Midwest that are going to see that? Do you think that's? I think that's worth talking about. Maybe
for sure. And this is one of those places where it gets really interesting. So, as a technologist who's also run multi-state enterprises, made acquisitions over the years of startups, that sort of thing, and even run international organizations. The arbitrage problem, as I like to think of it, is going to become only kind of more serious. And so, during the pandemic, you hear these stories of people who moved away and nobody knew because they weren't actually on site. They were remote, but they were still remote. It was a white wall behind them or a Zoom background. Now they live in Florida. and they live in Florida because Florida has no income tax.
Yep, same with Tennessee, right? Yeah,
right, exactly. So you are, I think, going to see a lot more competition, not for labor to run businesses, but for labor to relocate to some of these places. I lived in Wyoming for about 6 years, and Wyoming, almost everything is funded by a mineral tax. Mm-hmm. And so Wyoming ends up being a really good place, much like Delaware, to house a corporation because there's no corporate income tax, there's no personal income tax. The difference between Wyoming and Florida is not from a tax perspective. It's primarily about the weather.
You're right. Exactly. Yep.
So Florida is winning. But for people who love the natural beauty of hiking and want to be close to skiing or whatever, Wyoming's delightful. But we're now, I think, going to see competition for location of labor and geography inside of the U.S. in the same way we did in the late 90s and early 2000s between the U.S. and Eastern Europe or the Philippines or India, right? There was a lot to be said for labor arbitrage internationally. But now you're going to do it where you've got folks who are basically in the same time zones. They've got the same language background, et cetera. So whether you're talking about tech jobs or service jobs or support, why wouldn't you be located in Florida if you could, if you didn't have to pay taxes and real estate was pretty good and you loved the weather, right?
Right. I mean,
so Florida's going to win and Wyoming's maybe not. And so I think we're going to see a really acute competition between states in a way that we haven't really seen before.
Yeah,
powered by the same thing.
I agree, and I think there's a lot of I'm guessing at some point we will know there's going to be a lot of winners and losers, and we're not sure what that's going to look like. But Florida, one of the reasons Midwestern states tend to be precious to some is tax dollars are funding school systems and things like that, where that's not true. And, on the coast as much. And you go to private schools out there if you want to go get a good education for your kids and grow up, that the sense is. And so, these little flare-ups of state and local politics, I think are going to be interesting to watch what people are willing to kind of forego about their locale in order to attract these things. Because if you were to say, again, hearkening back to what I said before, we're trying to be the Silicon Valley of southeastern Wisconsin. Well, what's that going to take? I mean, literally, all bets are off. No rules. Do whatever the hell you want. Come in and join us here. There's no chance that that's going to happen. But if it doesn't happen, who's moving here for the weather? Like that many people. So
right.
It'll be interesting. And I think it'll be interesting, and I'm nervous about the divisiveness it's likely to cause, which is the polarization's already happening in our political system big time, and you feel like these types of things are really could exacerbate the problem. Don't you agree?
I think so.
Do you agree?
No, I do. I think that's true. I think we have a couple of things that there's an interstate commerce clause, and there are a few things that happen at the federal level, and they regulate highway systems and infrastructure and so on. But after that, states have always been competitive with one another in the large scale. So I think of when Amazon was talking about putting in another corporate center, and
it was a frenzy.
Cities and states absolutely went crazy to throw literally billions of dollars in tax incentives and otherwise. It's like winning a sports team or a stadium. They wanted the company, they wanted the cachet, they wanted the jobs, they wanted the ultimate, all of the spin-offs that would come from having it local to them. Now imagine the same thing happens, but it's on an individual taxpayer basis. Now, does everybody try to run to zero? Do you watch states that are otherwise built on one type of tax switch to another as they're competing not just to win a big company to come in, but they're like, hey, workforce, Right?
Exactly.
Like Florida. Right. Why doesn't Florida start to advertise in the Northeast or on the West Coast to say, if you can do your job remotely, you'd be crazy not to do it here, right? Better taxes, better weather, et cetera, et cetera. It'll be a Wild West kind of thing when states start competing for citizenry.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
And I will say, I'm a weird bird in this way. I love the seasons and I love the cold and the hot and all that. So Florida is the last place I would choose. I love Florida, but I love it for 10 days a year.
Yeah.
And but you're right. I think most people on the average, I think there's going to be a lot of strangeness happening, and I just don't think we've seen that amp up yet.
Not yet, but I think that's one of those things that the ability and appetite for remote work starts to catalyze, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't happen in the service industries. It doesn't happen in the face-to-face part of the economy. It can't really happen in retail. But then again, 25 years ago, you couldn't have imagined. I think my guess would be probably half our stuff shows up. Half of shopping trips have been deferred to online purchases, whether
you personally or in general.
Personally,
it's way different. We barely ever go shopping anymore. I mean, for stuff you get on Amazon, nobody goes anywhere.
Honestly, if we didn't have a grocery store a few blocks away. It might be even more than half. But we have such a perfect little community that it's really easy to shop locally and it's really convenient. I walk to get to coffee, for example.
And that's important. That's important. And we're sitting here in this little town that I live in. That is what is attractive about it. It's like it really connects your neighborhood in some sense. And we tried the whole ship us all of our groceries and we'll make sure we get real specific about how much we use and we'll have it shipped and it'll be much cheaper. It's like, stop. Like, this is terrible. I loved going to the grocery store. I liked walking around the grocery store and bumping into people.
I hate the grocery store.
Oh, really? Man.
Yeah, it's always much.
This is a big ding against you. It's first one, but that's bad news.
Yeah. I mean, there are times, actually, as long as it's not like after work when it's crowded and people are going nuts. But now, on the other hand, I Costco. Love it and hate it, both.
Yeah, there's definitely neighborhoods inside of Costco that are awesome.
Right.
And then there's certain neighborhoods you're like, what am I doing in this?
In my ear.
Yeah, exactly.
Do I really need 37 pounds of mayonnaise?
Yeah.
And the answer is yes,
typically,
as it turns out.
It's always yes. Yeah.
But no, it's one of those things that there are aspects that we even thought 20, 25 years ago were unassailable, like groceries coming to your home. My parents would go to the grocery store after work every day on the way home because they believed that, they wanted stuff to be fresh. And that, to a certain set of folks, going to the grocery store ever feels outrageous, right? I mean, and those are the kinds of things that have ultimately, when you stack them up, when you add them up, we'll have some significant changes. And I do think where people live and how they live and what states are going to do to attract those folks it's going to be really difficult for a while because there are absolute winners and losers. There are folks who have an intrinsic advantage today, whether it's the geography and the weather or it's the tax code that currently exists. And then there will be the folks who are losing that are going to try to figure out how to catch up if they can. And so the transition is usually the part where there's the most opportunity but the most chaos. And I think we're entering the transition in a meaningful way right now.
It does feel like there's a kind of an odd first mover thing happening where people are like really overdoing it. And it's like, be careful what kind of, deals you make with the devil here because you could regret it. And that this experiment really hasn't run anywhere for 100 years. It's run for 2 or 5, and it's like who knows what's happening to.
Well, I think I will say I think it's gone on longer than that.
Well, I'm saying in certain municipalities,
yeah,
they're now starting the full court press to attract.
Oh, for sure.
To attract stuff.
Yeah,
and they don't know what it means to them. Right.
Yeah. But like Florida had a really good startup community in kind of the St. Pete, Tampa area. Good tech hub. Some big companies went down there. And I think it was a combination of things like schools producing technologists, things like the weather, but also those intrinsic tax advantages. Because if you sold a startup and you were living there, very different treatment than if you were in California. Because why wouldn't you go to California? They have more students. They have great weather, etc. And so I think some of those advantages were being pressed at a different economic scale before.
Right.
But now you're right. At the individual, where do I live? Because my job can be anywhere. That's where the competition is, I think, heating up and kind of new.
And I think of it, I mean, I guess I have zero background, didn't study this at all, other than I study it every day now because it's kind of hitting you in the face. It feels like in some sense, these tech hub opportunities, and we have one locally, and it's great. I think they have the right, they want to do the right thing, right, and attract people to a locale. But I do think it's very competition based, and it's also playing kind of a zero sum type of a game where like if we just need to win, we can't lose this game. Versus thinking systemically. The problem is how far do you draw the boundaries then?
And people are all running the same play, all right? So the Milwaukee Tech Hub Coalition, there's Cortex in St. Louis.
Cincinnati, Indianapolis.
Absolutely. You can go to all of these
Green Bay.
cities, and they're all running the same play, which does make it a little bit of a zero-sum game. And that is something we need to work on, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think the real opportunity here is some dynamic person that is really able to pull this off, which I don't know, there's a lot of politics involved, but connecting those ecosystems together to create a kind of an ecosystem of ecosystems is, I think, important because it's like, each of these areas don't really have everything they actually need. The reason people loved, the reason as I've got some friends that have moved to Silicon Valley to do their thing, it's like, well, I could fall out of my office building and hit a web developer.
Right.
And that's all I needed. I needed that person.
Right.
Or I needed somebody that does chemical testing of this thing. Like the ability to find that is like super easy.
Right. Whereas
here, it used to not be that easy. Now it's a bit easier because you can find them. They just might not be sitting in your building.
It's like we've gone back thousands of years to the coincidence of wants, right? The barter system. That you have to have somebody who shows up in the marketplace who's got a chicken and wants flour, and you need flour, and you're going to trade it for a plant, and that plant guy really wants a chicken or whatever. Like, you had to have those goods and services kind of show up in the same place at the same time, and make those trades. And Silicon Valley is the efficient marketplace. There is so much demand and there is so much supply, and it's a portable skill set, and so they're just constantly matched. And so you run into this feast and famine. Like, you show up in Milwaukee to your, let's say your friends were looking there, and maybe those web developers all have jobs already, and they're not looking to move. They like their gig, and so they say, all right, well, let's go where the supply is. And maybe it's the other side. Like, those kids from WashU said, let me go where the demand is, right? So they went out to the valley so that they could be more portable. And that's you need the buyers and the sellers in the same place and at the same time. And it's hard to build up a marketplace from one side. Like, if you educate the heck out of folks, if you think about like Marquette and UW-M in Milwaukee, about 40% of the graduates stay in the area and about 60% leave. And of those 60%, 2/3 of them just go as far as Chicago, right? They're going not that far. A lot of them are from Illinois in that area. And then 20% go, more broadly. You're only keeping 2 out of 5. But the other 3, it's not that they're irrational. It's quite the opposite. They're going to where their first job is. Maybe they are relocating to the Valley because they're like, let me go join a big Google, Facebook, Apple, or Alphabet, one of these companies. It makes sense for them because it's not obvious that the advantages and opportunities here are going to count for much. So
yeah, and I do think, and again, I feel like,
but maybe the ecosystem of ecosystems helps with that.
And if nothing else, I think just transparency, awareness, being able to see, if I'm a, if I'm a financial services type, or if I'm a, whatever it is, most people aren't typically just true entrepreneurs only. They sort of have a discipline that they are interested in.
Yeah.
And there are places inside of the bigger Midwest, which is enormous, that probably have many things that you would really want and need. And the trick, I think, is like, it's not, if you don't find it in Milwaukee, well, just, pay your dues here for the next 15 years and hopefully we'll build it for you. No, it's not going to get
right.
That's never going to happen.
Nobody's going to wait that long.
There's no ag tech here. It's in Indianapolis, so it's not that far away. It's whatever it is, 3-hour car ride.
Yeah, healthcare hubs are Minneapolis or St. Louis, 100%. Not here, but they're all within 5 hours.
Exactly. And could we please just have let's just map the ecosystem for people and be more deliberate about that, because we all have something really important, I think, to share. But anyway, I do want to pivot because I know that's all the things we've talked about are good. I want to sort of tip into this idea of, well, let's go to the technology one.
Yeah.
Where do you think most people want to hear or should hear about from someone like yourself who's led enormous organizations? You've seen a lot. What part of the technology landscape that's there today do you think we should be really digging into, and which ones are emerging that we should start to funnel people toward, if possible?
Like specific technologies?
Yeah, I'm trying to dig into the technology part.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is really interesting, and it's worth talking about broadly, but then getting into specific technologies, is we'll call it there's the hype cycle, right? I think there's an overhype cycle and what we should do about it. And that might be your CEO or your board wants to know what you should be doing with Bitcoin. Not blockchain, because they don't know that yet. They heard about Bitcoin initially. Should we have Bitcoin? Should we hold Bitcoin? A true conversation. Maybe we need Bitcoin in case we get breached so we can pay a ransom. Right? These are the kinds of questions that I think are constantly coming up. And it doesn't matter, wait 5 years and it'll be something else, right?
Sure.
So, 5 years prior, it might not have been blockchain, but it might have been peer-to-peer distribution. And 5 years before that, it was Web 2.0. And 5 years before that, it was maybe Java. And what's interesting about those things is they come up, and they get, this enormous hype cycle. And oftentimes enterprises adopt and try things out. And usually there's more sizzle than steak. And usually the projects fail. And that's all because we're sort of too optimistic and too early out of the gate. We're getting ahead of ourselves. We're there before technologies are matured.
Right.
The cloud, when it first came out, was clunky and insecure, etc. But the cloud today, you'd be kind of crazy to have a startup where you said, all right, let's get on-prem and let's roll out a data center and let's be capitally intensive. Yeah. So, there are winners and there are losers. But the way we approach technology generally and technology advances, I think, is worth talking about, is worth saying what is the right time. We were talking about FOMO earlier, and I think that's a huge part of it. I do think that people are worried about missing out. Well, what if our competition, I hear they're using blockchain, right? I heard that it's essential for supply chain. I heard that if we're not in it, we're not part of this open marketplace, right? Or whatever. And, that approach is fascinating, but it burns an awful lot of cycles, kills a lot of attention before things are early. On the other hand, like I said, sometimes if it's something like the cloud, you probably still didn't get a lot of advantage for being an early mover. But now that it's matured, you'd sort of be crazy not to.
Right.
And so decision making around new technologies and what to adopt and when and why is something that I think there's a lot of fertile ground there.
Oh, yeah. And I think by the way, I mean, I agree with everything you said, and I've experienced a bunch of that. I do think in some sense there are multiple playbooks. I mean, there's one type of organization that, look, if your leadership really wants to innovate or in whatever you're doing, there are things you should be doing to build this culture. It's not a specific technology thing, and it's not a project, because these massive projects have come with enormous amount of expectations. But if you're studying the cloud in the early days of the cloud, you should be studying it. You shouldn't be expecting it to do something for you necessarily. And if it does, you're way better off. In my perspective, I guess that's a type of playbook. There's another type of playbook which a lot of companies follow, which is, we want to be fast followers of this technology cycle. We don't really have the people to go explore the new frontier. And, how do you coach people that you're not going to miss it? Just stay in the pocket. And this is what it means. And, I think that's fun to talk about. And it's interesting because a lot of people are angry that, a lot of frontline developer types or people that are working on projects inside of companies are like, we're not innovative. It's like, well, what are you trying to be innovative in?
Right. Are you innovating in your core, or are you using, are you trying to find a better hammer for what you do?
Yeah.
And I actually encourage a lot of my leaders to look at the technology section of the Wall Street Journal almost defensively, because that's what your board's going to talk about in the next meeting, right?
Yeah.
So if
you need to guide them in the right path. Yeah.
If they're talking about ransomware, your board will be asking questions about it. If they're talking about the cloud, your board will be asking questions about it. It is really interesting to see how technology is a place that a lot of non-technologists are more than comfortable wading in on.
Right.
Because of that sort of FOMO effect and what they're reading in the press.
Actually, that was another question I was going to ask you. One of the ways I keep up with, I tinker that's what I like to do, is why I'm in this business. But I have teammates or people that work for me that are insanely talented people. And I'm just constantly asking them questions like I'm a kid in a candy store. When I hear about something that they're working on, I just want to talk to them about it and really deepen my understanding. But that only goes so far without touching the thing. How do you, as a person leading, endless numbers of these little technology blips and new things and old things and legacy things, how do you either coach your teams to stay up to date, or how do you by yourself stay up to date? And how would we express some interesting ways to do that to people out there that have roles like this or that are in businesses?
Yeah, sometimes it's sort of direct research and playing around. And that's kind of one of those things that you can do now that, again, is different. If you want to download a copy of an open source blockchain implementation and play around with it, you can.
Right.
If you want to go deep in Wikipedia and a couple of explainers on YouTube, you can. You can start to learn some of those things directly. I think relying on colleagues, teammates, teammates, friends, etc., who are themselves more deeply ingrained in it. That's awesome. There are industries around keeping you up to date these days, which is also kind of neat. Not to pick a winner or to give them too much credit, but like take a Gartner. Right. Gartner does a white paper on everything that they think is going to be relevant to, let's say, CIOs and CTOs and practitioners. And so, they'll publish a lot of them for free. A lot of them are kind of behind their paywall. But whether it's a tech topic or a leadership in tech topic or a outsource tooth to tail ratio, what should you have in terms of build versus maintain? Like, it's all there. Somebody's done the research for it. Now, I don't think that the practical experience is a substitute. The way you implement something will be unique to your own company, to your own region, etc. But the bones of a lot of really good stuff, it's just out there and at your fingertips in a way that it never used to be. So, taking someone to lunch can be as good or better than reading a white paper also.
I also think this, I love that. And I think it's almost like it's just part of the way you show up. It's like you go to work and somebody's sent you two of these things, you just skim them or read them if you're real interested, if it's something you need. But I will say that there's a perspective, just related to what is it that once I find that thing that I'm interested in, and I'm talking about, it can be whatever, blockchain or new data technologies, Snowflake. I just read about this new thing. I think talking through like, what should people's expectations be about doing it practically, like trying it? Is it Snowflake is a new thing, everyone loves it, we should just hire a big, massive effort to shift everything there? Or is it, no, you need to invest in people that can actually do some things that you will throw away. You need to develop the skill to do that. And if you don't have the capacity or the fortitude to have even that, you're never going to be wildly successful with fairly new technology or features or processes or things. Do you buy that, or do you have a different way to think about it?
I get worried every time someone proposes technology as a panacea, because they're compensating for a different type of mismanagement. And so you'd say, well, our legacy databases are a mess because we never had schema governance. We never had data governance, or we have too much legacy, or we have 50 different types of databases and too much diversity, et cetera.
Right. I
get skeptical that an N+1 solution, that you're going to add something to the environment that you won't actually get worse. Right. That you'll spread your bets. Your team will be thinned out a little bit more. You'll have one other thing. And so sometimes people create heuristics for it. Like, okay, you can add one database, but every time you do so, you got to kill two, right? So maybe that eventually moves you to reduction. But the idea that you're either going to add something new in a pilot and a prototype and try it out and make your world a better place, or you've got this escapist fantasy. I'm just going to take all my legacy, and we never thought about it before, but this is the perfect tool, and now we'll just move all our data to Snowflake and the world will be good. No way.
Yeah.
There's and it's something that got you to a place that you're looking to escape right now. And unless you address that, unless it's a funding issue that you're going to solve, or a governance issue that you're going to solve, or a legacy cleanup, tech debt kind of thing, like unless you address that root cause, and unless that new technology is somehow aimed at your root cause, I tend to go in pretty skeptically.
Yeah, I just feel like
there's a reason you're running away from your problems.
and you the tendency seems to be you create exactly the same problem on a new platform.
N+1, it's worse.
Yeah,
right?
It's worse.
Yeah.
But so I think that is like you say, fertile ground for us to have a conversation related to that.
Yeah.
Where do you? And I know we've got just a few more minutes. We talk about a couple more things that we want to talk about in general, but when you're thinking about a Gartner or Fortis, some of these places, and you say, here are the things that I really think leadership in technology or in business, it doesn't matter what type, but here's where I think they're probably lacking more than they need to, and they should be studying this and they're not.
Right.
Same with technologists. Like, do you have a perspective of, do you have an opinion about that? Here is the things that business and tech leadership should be thinking about. And technologists are just they never do this, and why wouldn't they? That kind of thing.
Yeah, the missing link. So I think discipline and standardization are the things that are absolutely missing, and you don't find in Gartner. Like, you don't find them telling you, and again, Snowflake's awesome, but you don't find them telling you, don't use Snowflake unless you are going to take 2 or 3 other systems out. And completely replace them. You don't hear them saying, they say automation is good, but they don't tell you that you need governance of that automation. They tell you that a particular language and runtime, your JRE has these sorts of features, but they don't tell you that having just Java and getting rid of, C++ and Haskell and some things that actually sound maybe newer and more exciting is a huge advantage, because discipline and standardization are sometimes 100 times more valuable than the fit for purpose, best of breed kind of solution. That's one thing that I don't see enough attention paid to.
Yeah.
Is that running a large, and either whether it's a complicated business, a large or complicated company, a large or complicated code base, the value of standardization is incredible. Like, I don't see Gartner articles on you shouldn't have more than 5 languages in production, regardless of what you're doing, right? They'd never say that. They always say the opposite, obviously be more innovative, try things that are new, best of breed, fit for purpose, etc. But being an organization that has to split its bets, has a small number of people that know how to service something or how to touch something as opposed to everybody, there's something there that I think as technologists we oftentimes get excited about. We like adding the new exciting technology or the new exciting language or the new runtime or the new tool when we could probably create as much or more value by getting rid of things. Spending our time doing that.
Yeah. And analyzing the situation in a way that is reasonable, or not reasonable, but you're just taking a unbiased view, unvarnished view of the situation, and then you may end up saying we don't need all these new tools to solve something we're doing. You just don't like that tool.
Yeah.
And I will say, thinking about that from a leader's perspective, I get, and you got to put a structure in place, and et cetera. But I do think technologists have a lot to do with this, because you're trying to attract people. It's just a never-ending discussion. How many things am I working on? How awesome are they?
Yeah.
That there's something to that, but giving people the ability to do that before you adopt it whole hog is a skill.
Yeah.
And I think that's a coordinated conversation. How do you get there? But you can't constrain it completely. Probably in this day and age, you got to let some of these people that are interested in exploring that space do it safely. Yeah. Somehow.
Well, and people scream. They hate the idea that you're telling them no. Developers especially want the, quote, ability to innovate, etc. I went through this at Yahoo. We had 4 source control systems, and that was bad. Mm-hmm. Meant it was difficult to do code scanning. Deployment tools were tough. It was really hard to reason about. Yeah, security, absolutely. So we had Perforce, which was commercial. We had CVS, which was free. We had Subversion, and then of course Git, right? Because Git was now. You look back and you say, well, at the time, Git was probably the best technology. It was. And currently, you'd be crazy to go to one of those other things over, say, just getting on GitHub or whatever. And we chose not Git. We chose Subversion. The reason was we could upgrade the old things to Subversion. Subversion worked with our tool chain, and we actually believed that as much as some of our advanced developers were really comfortable with distributed version control, that was not the right thing for our enterprise. Having, authoritative copies of software in places other than a central repository, and which was how it was managed by those teams, not a good thing. So we moved everybody to one thing, moved them to Subversion. And there was a really vocal group that said, hey, we don't like it. We're moving backwards. Why wouldn't we move forward in technology? And the answer, and it took a lot of management discipline to say this, was, look, we do not differentiate our products based on source control. It doesn't make a difference. At the end of the day, using stone tablets might be slow, but it wouldn't impact the consumer experience.
Right.
And so you have to convince your developer community, for example, to argue about things that matter to the business. And if it doesn't, sometimes you're going to say no, and it's good for the business, and there will be winners and losers. But if you're not willing to pick winners and losers, you will continuously sprawl. You'll add complexity. You'll have too many tools, etc. You don't find that discipline in Gartner.
Yeah, it's funny, and I will say that I know that there are. I even resist, in the past, I've resisted the phrase best practices. It's like, no, there's good practices. There's very few best, but when you find a best, you use it. I've come to realize, I think, in the course of leading many teams, many technologies and things, that's probably not true. There are some real best practices, focus areas, and there's best practices for us. It doesn't have to be for the market, right? But you make an incredibly good point. Here's one question that I would want us to dig into. How do you can do this effectively because you know what source control even is. This sounds absurd, but
right,
but
sure.
I've met a lot of technical leaders who don't have a single shred of technical understanding. So to talk about source control is absurd to them.
Yeah.
So
that's true.
My interest here is probably a focus on one. I think there should be more people like you who are technically built, who are working on how to lead human beings and big organizations. And I think there's a lot to be said about elevating those people, if they want to be, into that type of role. Yeah. I also think there's a conversation to be had of, okay, there's all these people out there that don't know boo about a particular about technology in general, and they're saying they're creating organizations built on technical premises. Yeah. And it's like, how are you doing that?
It's super scary. Yeah. I do think it's a big topic. It's one that I used to be less passionate about. Because I used to think there were some general principles of management and financial acumen and the ability to do purchasing and all these sorts of things that counted for a lot. And I still think that's true. But I think the non-technical leader leading technology functions is a little bit crazy in this day and age. And if you look backwards, you'd never have a head controller that wasn't an actuary, right? It'd be illegal in a lot of places. You wouldn't have a general counsel who wasn't an attorney, right? You would. Yeah. It turns out a lot of these other disciplines, of course, have sort of strong controls and expectations around who runs them. And yet you might have someone do a rotation through the top of the house in tech because they think they're exposed to it. Like they're like, oh, I use the consumer app. I know what our digital experience should be like. I know what our customers want. And that can be true. But if you're not the same person who is also making the decision about source control, you shouldn't be in that seat because your hardest decisions aren't going to be the ones that are market facing. Your hardest decisions, it's not that hard to look at an amazing ecosystem like Apple or an experience like Amazon and replicate it. It actually turns out the market can lead you to all those easy answers, but the way you run your back office, the way you tie into your ERP system or don't, the choices you make around language sprawl or not, turns out that's all the value you can create. The rest of it, you can almost consult your way there. Or rely on somebody else.
You don't need all these incredible thinkers inside your company.
So I worry about the proliferation of we'll call them the less technical tech leaders.
And I actually think they can be successful, right? They can be successful if they have maybe a particular pathway to make those decisions, and they lean on But most of the time, what I see, and definitely in big tech organizations inside of a different organization, it's 7 different sub parts of the tech organization. They all make their own decisions because it's a team and they need their own things. And there's nobody saying, wait a second, all this shit has to connect.
Yeah.
It all has to integrate. There is no one of us. We're all relying on each other in a value stream. We should talk about that, and then maybe as a group we should be forced to make decisions like I think you're saying. It just doesn't work like that often.
I think like if you look at a large retail operation, you could come up with a consumer loyalty program that touches in store and an online app, and it's tied to your discount card that you purchase with, etc. And yet you could outsource that whole thing. On the other hand, having, let's say, a microservices architecture strategy for how everything's tied together inside your shop, that is going to make or break your technology function over the long term, which has almost, and again, it's sort of crazy to say, but almost nothing to do with what your consumer experience is.
Right.
That if you're a craftsman, and you can build technology right, it almost doesn't matter what you're going to do with it, right? Like when you go to the Home Depot, you've got 50 types of hammers, but inside the 16-ounce framing hammer category, they're more or less the same. You get a couple of different materials. Turns out there's a head on it, there's a nail puller, there's a handle, and you're swinging away. If you don't know how to swing a hammer and use a hammer, you don't need to know that particular house somebody's going to build, much less what color it's going to be painted. You just need to know how to build this tool to help people do framing, and the rest of it's up to the architects and the interior designers and the landscapers and all the people who are going to put that skin on there. It's a very different set of skills, and you get a lot of folks in there who are these days really good at that exterior design, and yet couldn't tell you about building codes. Couldn't tell you about fire breaks and framing walls. And
those are the things that are probably going to kill someone and make the thing livable or not. But tipping into the last comment, I guess we can just quickly finish is all of what we just said, probably more, but those things I think are interesting. Maybe there's a few things we want to dig into, but people that we would want to discuss it with are people in these roles, executives making these choices, people that are business partners that are asking someone else to make these choices that we want to sort of, I don't know, interrogate's a tough word, but, really dig into to try to understand, because I think it would be nice to share that with others. It would be fun to talk about and explore the space a bit.
Yeah.
So I think having guests on, I don't know if that resonates, but that type of guest maybe would be a fun discussion and important in some way.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges will be to get those guests to take provocative positions.
Agreed.
To be very political in their answers.
Maybe we could come up with a way like, hey, look, we're going to run a whole new business. How would you set it up? Just to see if we could get because I agree with you. It's going to be a lot of tiptoeing around.
Right. Just about anything can work
Yeah. Well, okay. So that's where we'll head. We'll have to figure out a fun little game to play to trick people into telling us what we want.
The clean sheet of paper. Right?
That's right. So I appreciate your time. This is fun. this is a good little stepping stone, I think, to some more conversations, and hopefully we can parlay this. I wouldn't call it planning. This sort of thing we just did to start booking some people and having these conversations.
Yeah, excellent.
All right. Well, thanks for the chat.
Indeed.